I have a question for you. As something that you talked about, and you had already talked about it in your letter to the federal ministers, that is, that according to the Quebec government, the provincial and federal provisions that will be adopted will have to be exempt from any ambiguity in order to be implemented effectively. And when we heard from the senior officials from Justice and Health, and also confirmed by the minister when she appeared before committee, she had indicated the federal government's intent to defend the federal law in where a Quebec citizen might challenge the Quebec law with regard to the ban on growing plants at home. So here's my question. When you talk about being exempt from ambiguity, can you tell me what you mean by that? Because also today you talked about that more clarity is needed to prevent needless court challenges. Could you tell us a little bit more what you think what is the clarity that would be needed around that? Based on the federal minister's statements, and I am saying that under the criminal code, the federal government decides that there cannot be 5 plants or more in one's home. Well, that's one thing, and I think that the federal government can decide on that. It can prohibit that. But where there's a limit to what it can do is in the case of authorizations. And because that goes back to private law, and those authorizations come under provincial jurisdiction. And so the decision that we have made, for the reasons that I said in my presentation, are which seek to ensure that cannabis use is not normalized and that producers are above board, and so that we can educate the public properly. So we sought to make sure that cannabis was not grown at home. So because we want controlled retail outlets. Now, banning 5 or more plants, it was said that it's, you can't say 0. It has to be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. So that is provincial jurisdiction, and that is where there is a constitutional problem. Now, this is ambiguous, not only because the minister claimed the contrary. Now, that is my interpretation, encouraging the challenge of a provincial law. Now, do we want our 2 governments to produce 2 different pieces of legislation, and where one of the ministers responsible is seeking to elicit challenges? I mean, we're adopting our law because the federal government really forced us to. So I think that more clarity in this bill would permit us to have more clarity around the constitutional rule, and it would bring us to cooperate for the good of all citizens, because the citizens both in Quebec and at the federal level pay their taxes, and that should not be used for legal proceedings. That's something that is simply not acceptable. Thank you, Senator. Senator Boisvenu, Vice